Hi there. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I'm Laura from the Comstock Park branch, and we have a great program lined up for you tonight about Michigan and the novel with special guest Adam Oster from the Library of Michigan. So find a comfy spot and settle in. Adam is going to take us on an adventure exploring late 19th century and early 20th century novelists and the impacts that their books have had on us today. So welcome, Adam. Thanks so much for coming today.
Hi, Laura. It's good to see you. All right. So I think we'll just go ahead and get started. And just to kind of introduce a little bit more about myself, like Laura said, I am the community engagement librarian for the Library of Michigan. And I've been there about almost a year, a little over a year and a half. Prior to that, I was actually working with Laura at Kent District Library, though I worked over at the Kentwood branch for most of the time that I was there. So just to talk a little bit about the Library of Michigan before we get into the entire presentation itself. Laura, just to make sure you have, there we go, got it up. Just to kind of talk a little bit about how I first got interested in a lot of older books by Michigan authors. The one who really kind of got my attention when I was much younger, probably about 4th, 5th grade, is a guy by the name of Meindert De Jong, who was originally born in the Netherlands in 1906, and then he immigrated to the United States in 1914, and ended up living in the Grand Rapids area, went to Calvin College, and then later on went to the University of Chicago. Held a bunch of different jobs during the Great Depression, and then started writing children's books at the suggestion of a local librarian from the Grand Rapids Public Library. His first book, The Big Goose and the Little White Duck, was published in 1938. He later on served in the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II. And one of his really big claim to fame is that he won the International Hans Christian Andersen Award, the first American to do so in 1962 for his contributions as a children's writer. And then he spent several years in Mexico, returned to Michigan, later lived in North Carolina, and then spent the last final years of his life in Michigan before dying in 1961. The book that really I was introduced to when I first learned about him was The Wheel on the School. And you'll notice that the pictures that were illustrated for the book were by Maurice Sendak, who has done a lot of different illustrations for a lot of different books, most notably for Where the Wild Things Are. And after learning a little bit more about De Jong, he wrote a lot of well-respected and award-winning books. I sort of think of him as just like during the early mid-1950s, he was constantly on the Newbery Award or Newbery Honor list. His books, Shadrach, which came out in 1953, was an honor book, Newbery Honor book. Hurry Home Candy was an honor book in 1950, also in 1954. Won the Newbery Medal in 1955 for The Wheel on the School. The House of 60 Fathers, which was an honor book in 1957. Along Came a Dog, honor book in 1959. And then the National Book Award in Children's Books in 1969 for Journey from Peppermint Street. And 6 books were illustrated by Maurice Sendak for Meindert De Jong, with the one that isn't on this list being The Little Cow and the Turtle, which was published in 1955. So me being a younger kid, getting to learn a lot about literature of Michigan just from finding some of these books at the local library that I went to. I grew up in Zeeland and spent many, many times going to the Howard Miller Library there and finding a lot of good books, especially these ones that are much more older. And so transitioning from that, I'm going to talk just for a minute or two about the Library of Michigan itself. Might be some people that aren't necessarily aware of who we are and what we do. We were initially established in 1828 as the Michigan Territorial Library. Only 2 other libraries existed in Michigan at that time prior to us, and that was the library at the University of Michigan and then the Detroit Public Library. We were created to help the legislative council for the territorial government. And the foundation of that is what is now the current state law library and the state documents collection that's at the current Library of Michigan today. We became the Michigan State Library in 1837 once we transitioned from a territory to a state, and then moved from Detroit, being originally in Detroit because that was where the state capital was, moved to Lansing in 1847. And I've heard that it was done during the winter because it was a lot easier to move all of the books over frozen ground rather than doing it in the mud of spring or other times during the year where it could be raining and much more difficult to haul all that collection. State librarians have primarily, in the beginning, were just part-timers and caretakers until the 1860s, and then they started expanding the role of the state library, doing so much more in order to help libraries in general in Michigan into more rural areas, and providing support for the history of our state, collecting those types of materials, and also serving state government. So quite a bit has changed even since that time period. Different types of things that we offer. Like I said, with Michigan's history, it's recounted through our collections and spans the entire written history of Michigan, including the Old Northwest Territory and the Michigan Territory. Multiple different collections provide layers of information from different sources. We have collections on everything from Michigan government documents to the law collection with the State Law Library. Other things within our Michigan materials include newspapers, periodicals, gazetteers, plat maps, county and place histories, unpublished material, local government resources. But then a section is also included on the works of fiction by Michigan, or about Michigan, or by Michigan authors. So, and that's what we're going to be focusing on over the course of the rest of the presentation. If you're also aware of the Michigan eLibrary, that is something that is facilitated through us and the Midwest Collaborative for Library Services. So you will find that many of the books that we talk about today may be something that you have to request through MELCAT, which is part of MEL. So it's good to throw that out there, and just in case that these are ones that you want to find and not necessarily are able to find them at your own home library. When it comes to works about Michigan and by Michigan authors, we try to collect all literary works where Michigan is a setting or a work is by a Michigan author. Since 1991, items have been celebrated through the Read Michigan, or what is now the Michigan Notable Books program. And just to kind of list some more well-known authors that have been featured in the Michigan Notable Books program that are from Michigan, would include Gary Schmidt, Jack White, the musician, Richard Ford, Jamie Gordon, Bonnie Jo Campbell, Josh Mallerman, that's who is now got another one coming out that is going to be a sequel to Bird Box, which was the one that was made into a film just a few years ago. Marty Jo Link, Jim Harrison was a written author for many different years, and he only just passed away just within the last decade or so. Christopher Paul Curtis from the east side of Michigan has written a lot of youth and teen-oriented books. So just a lot of notable authors are from our state who have won either National Book Awards or Newbery, or a lot of different forms of recognition. But we're going to be talking more about the older works. Just because something maybe hasn't been published in a while, or it's sort of fallen out of being known, doesn't mean that it's a bad book. It just means that other books have come out over time, and it's sometimes good to look for some of those classic ones that are by Michigan authors or are about our state. So trying to find them, well, you're not always going to find them right away, so it's good to find out what ones exist out there. Some good useful resources, and I used all of these for the creation of this presentation. The first one, Michigan in the Novel, which is where the title of this presentation has come from, which is a compilation a bibliography put together by Robert Biesacker, who is the head of special collections over at Grand Valley State University. So that's considered one of the best books if you're trying to find any titles that were published about Michigan in that date range of 1816 to 1996. Another one by Clarence Andrews, Michigan in Literature, is certainly a good one. The Ink Trails 1 and Ink Trails 2 by Dave Dempsey and Jack Dempsey, which not only alert you to different famous and forgotten Michigan authors, but they also give biographical information, talk about more how they are related directly to Michigan, and a lot of good information if you're looking for something that isn't just a list, but also gives you a little bit more of a narrative focus about these either famous or forgotten authors. A great source that's also available that's produced by the Michigan Association of Media and Education, as well as the Library of Michigan and the Michigan Center for the Book, is the Michigan Authors and Illustrators database. This is available through the Library of Michigan website, and it provides both a quick search and an advanced search for finding authors with ties to Michigan. One of my more favorite parts of it is that you can narrow authors down by county. So if you wanted to find an author that was from Kent County or had some sort of focus to Kent County in Michigan or Ottawa County or Newaygo County, that it lets you narrow it down by location to see what has more of a local focus of authors of who you're looking for. So now we're going to spend a little bit of time just talking about what sort of well-known authors from the late 19th and early to mid 20th century, maybe ones that you know of but didn't know that they had a connection to Michigan, or maybe you're aware of them and just didn't know what titles that they had. So we're going to go through probably about a half dozen or so just to showcase. One of the ones that is certainly important to when it comes to Michigan authors is James Curwood. And so he was born in Owasso in 1878. He studied at the University of Michigan, but then he eventually quit college to become a reporter and moved to Detroit for work. And then later returned back to Owasso to focus on his writing. Although he did a lot of his writing there, he would often travel to the Yukon and Alaska for several months each year for inspiration for his books. At least 18 movies have been based on or inspired by Curwood's novels and short stories. And you'll find one of the pictures that's on here is of Curwood Castle, which is in Owasso, and he built that as a sort of a writing studio. And it's still around today. You can go visit it. It's used as a museum now. So it's also a literary landmark in Michigan. So it's been officially recognized as one of, I think there's about 8 or 9 literary landmarks that are in the state. And he died in 1927. So let's just look at a sample of some of his books and see if there's any of these that you've read or would potentially look to read yourself. So Kazan came out in 1914, and it's one of those classic wilderness adventure stories that features the wolf. Kazan is the main character. So just a little bit of a synopsis of it. Kazan lay mute and motionless, his gray nose between his forepaws, his eyes half closed. A rock could have appeared scarcely less lifeless than he. Not a muscle twitched, not a hair moved, not an eyelid quivered, yet every drop of the wild blood in his splendid body was racing in a ferment of excitement that Kazan had never before experienced. So it's kind of a lot like your Call of the Wild type of book, and focusing more where you've got the animal as the main character. You'll find the same thing in this next one, The Grizzly King, which was published in 1916. It would later become titled as The Bear and adopted as a film in 1988, which focuses on 2 bears, a grizzly named Thor and Muskwa, a motherless bear cub, who become companions in the Canadian wilderness, going from one adventure to another. all trying to escape two bear trappers that are drawing nearer and nearer to them. And then when we get to this next one, The Courage of Marge O'Doone, this is where we're transitioning from having animals as the main characters, but now into more human characters. And so this focuses on a man troubled by his inner demons meets a stranger on a train to the northern wilderness. Along the way, their adventure is filled with dog sledges, Indians, and a quest for inner peace and redemption. And then in 1919, The River's End, which is where two men who resemble each other physically lead very different lives. Coniston is a member of the Northwest Mounted Police, and Keith is an outlaw. The physical trait linked these men together. So it's all about sort of the different adventures that they go on due to the fact that they have the same appearance. It's kind of that Man in the Iron Mask type of story that we might be familiar with, and is Curwood's sort of take on that style of story. Next, we have Harriette Simpson Arnow, who is not originally from Michigan, but later came to Michigan and spent quite a bit of time living there. And so she was born in 1908 in Kentucky, and her time in Kentucky did quite a bit to influence what her writing was about. She attended Berea College and then the University of Louisville to teach school, and then served briefly as an elementary school principal. Later, she moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, where she worked as a waitress, a sales clerk, typist, and then eventually a writer for the Federal Writers Project, which was brought about during the Great Depression in order to support writers and other people who were composing theater shows or other different things in order to keep, funding for writers going even in the midst of an economic crisis. She got married to her husband Harold in 1938 and then moved back to Kentucky and then left for Michigan in 1945. And so from 1945 up until her death in 1986, she spent that time mainly around the Ann Arbor area. So that's kind of how we can claim her as a Michigan author, that she just spent so much of that time spending it in Michigan. So these are some of the books that she's more well known for. Mountain Path, which came out in 1936, which focuses on a woman named Louisa who, in order to earn money for her final year of college, she agrees to teach school in a remote Kentucky community called Canebrake. In 1949, it was Hunter's Horn that was published, and this is sort of that quintessential novel of Southern Appalachian farmers, fox hunters, foxhounds, women, and children. It is the story of Nun Ballow's private war with a fox he called King Devil, and it does not seem foolish or careless to say that the conflict recalls Captain Ahab's pursuit of the white whale Moby Dick. So something that has a little bit of that same sort of flavor of what you would find in Robert Louis Stevenson's book, Moby Dick. And then lastly, the one that we're going to focus on is The Dollmaker, which was published in 1954 and then adapted as a TV film in 1984. And this is where we have strong-willed, self-reliant Gertie Neville's peaceful life in the Kentucky hills is devastated by the brutal winds of change. Uprooted from her backwoods home, she and her family are thrust into the confusion and chaos of wartime Detroit. And in a pitiless world of inevitable poverty, Gertie will battle fiercely and relentlessly to protect those things that she holds most dear, her children, her heritage, and her triumphant ability to create beauty in the suffocating shadow of ugliness and despair. So that's Harriette Simpson Arnow. Another one who we claim, who unfortunately moved out of Michigan, and I was sort of back and forth trying to decide whether or not I wanted to include her or not. But I figured, she was born in Kalamazoo, we get to kind of hold on to her and claim her. And so Edna Ferber was born in Kalamazoo in 1885, and then later moved to Chicago with her family, and then to Iowa, and then back to Chicago, and then to Appleton, Wisconsin. She spent some time working for the Appleton Daily Crescent as a reporter, and then later for the Milwaukee Journal. Her first published story, The Homely Heroine, appeared in Everybody's Magazine in 1910. And then her first novel, titled Dawn O'Hara, The Girl Who Laughed, appeared in print in 1911. And then from 1912, for the rest of her life until her death in 1968, she spent it in New York. And so here are a couple examples of her works, and you'll see why, just based on the titles, why it's she's such a well-known author. So the first one that we're featuring here, So Big, which was a Pulitzer Prize winner for the novel in 1925, focuses on the rollicking panorama of Chicago's high and low life, follows the travails of gambler's daughter, Selena De Jong, as she struggles to maintain her dignity, her family, and her sanity in the face of monumental challenges. And then Showboat, which was published in 1926, became a musical in 1927, and then was adopted as a movie 3 times, 1929, 1936, and 1951. The 1936 film version featured Hattie McDaniel, the Academy Award winner, who has been in a number of other different movies. The book itself focuses on the Mississippi River and the showboats that ran up and down it. It's the timeless tale of the Cotton Blossom, Captain Andy, and his shrewd wife, Parthy, and their beautiful daughter, Magnolia, and her remarkable daughter, Kim. So all the different adventures of them going up and down the Mississippi River and getting more of that time period of the past focus to it. And another one of Ferber's is Cimarron, which came out in 1929, also adopted as a film in 1931 and in 1960. It received the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1931, and this focuses on the development of Oklahoma after the land rush. It's a novel that's set in the late 19th and early 20th century and follows the lives of Yancey and Sabra Cravat, beginning with Yancey's tale of his participation in the 1893 land rush. They immigrate from Wichita, Kansas to the fictional town of Osage, Oklahoma, along with their son. And then it focuses also on their time while in Osage as they were working on a newspaper, building their fortune amongst Indian disputes and outlaws and the discovery of oil in Oklahoma. And then Giant in 1952, which would later be adopted as a film in 1956 that starred Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson and James Dean. And that book focuses on the larger-than-life cattle rancher Jordan Benedict, who arrives at the family home of sharp-witted but genteel Virginia socialite Leslie Linton to purchase a racehorse, and the two of them are instantly attracted to each other. Also gets into all of the oil in Texas and dealing with riches and poverty and racism that's suffered by Mexican workers on the ranch. So another one of those books that becomes into a major motion picture, and a lot of people are probably knowing the fact that of the movie itself, but not necessarily that it was by somebody who was from the state of Michigan. Maritta Wolff is another Michigan author who was born in Grass Lake in 1918. And so she's a little bit more of a modern, well-known author, and not somebody who was born in more the mid to late 1800s. So she attended the University of Michigan, and while she was there, she produced an 830-page manuscript for a composition class that would receive the university's 1940 Avery Hopwood Prize for Writing. She later redrafted it into a 450-page book called Whistle Stop, and that later became a film in 1946. She would move to the Los Angeles area in the 1950s, but then stopped writing sometime after 1962. She died July 1, 2002, so only within the last couple decades. And they would later, or find a manuscript that had been completed by her in the 1970s that somehow was stored in a refrigerator. And it would later be published as the book Sudden Rain in 2005. So, like some authors that are out there, you'll find unwritten works that eventually get produced into material, and she happens to be one of those ones that just had something that never did end up getting published until after her death. So these are some of the ones that are by her. So Whistle Stop, that first one that was based on that, the composition that she produced while she was going to the University of Michigan, is set in a small town Midwestern life in post-Depression America. The story of the Beach family, an oversized, poverty-stricken tribe trying to make good in a cruel world. Through the course of a punishing hot summer, we experience life with the 6 children and the 3 adult Beaches as they bicker, brawl, make up, and provide titillating morsels of scandal for their neighborhood. And then we have Night Shift, that was published in 1942 and became a film. It was renamed The Man I Love in 1947. And this is about Sally Otis, who works to the bone as a waitress, supporting her 3 children and a jobless young sister. With bills mounting and no rest in sight, Sally's resolve is beginning to crumble when her swaggering older sister, Petey Braun, appears on the scene. And all the adventures that goes on between them and what happens to them, and how it will forever alter the Otis family as Sally is trying to support everyone. About Letty Thomas came out in 1943. And it's the story dealing with marital divorce and yet trying to be kind and fair to her selfish husband, the main character. But it deals with a husband that has a drinking problem, abuse, it grows worse, and the main character develops a sense of guilt, tries to kill her. She runs away, first traveling about the country and then home again to the Salt of the Earth Gardaí fan. She is sharply aware of the problems of their 2 veterans. So a lot of different things that are going on in sort of a broken family type of situation in About Letty Thomas. Back of Home, which was published in 1952, which deals with another whistle stop out of Chicago, small town at the back end of nowhere. Focuses on Sherry, who had been after the smart Angles and the smart big money had left town, and Nell, who he'd always loved, returns there with Faye, whom he'd married, now dying of cancer. And as Faye, unloved and unloving in her last months, tries to hold him in the sick room with a vicious, vengeful tyranny. Sherry takes up with Nell again, knows no peace, but only the promise of her love once Faye is dead. So very, very much more of a soap opera-ish type of book. If you're wanting to sort of get the back and forth of who's doing what, how it's impacting different family or people who they are in love with. So if you want something that's a little bit more of that flavor, Back of Town is going to be that kind of book. Next is John Voelker, also known as Robert Traver. John Voelker was born in 1903 in Ishpeming, Michigan. He attended Northern Michigan University starting in 1922, graduated with a teaching certificate, and then transferred to the University of Michigan Law School. He served as an attorney and county prosecutor in Marquette County, and a lot of that experiences would influence much of his writing. In as far as the titles that I'm going to be featuring. Now, he did also write a lot of bit about trout fishing, and I'm not going to really talk about those books because those are ones that sort of came much more later on in his life in the mid to late 1960s and later. I'm going to be focusing on more of his earlier stuff. But he was appointed to the Michigan Supreme Court in 1957, and his writings, in order to separate himself from being, the Supreme Court justice, he was writing under the name of Robert Traver, because that was sort of his way of having a different identity in order to be able to write about more of an autobiographical way without necessarily naming himself. He died in 1991 in Marquette. I also included a picture here of the Marquette County Courthouse because that's where many of his stories take place, and it's also considered a legal landmark and literary landmark of Michigan. And so it's kind of, I'm not that long ago, I was up in the UP, and it was kind of neat actually getting to walk outside of the building and sort of reflect on the fact of like, oh, this is where John Voelker was practicing law, and a lot of his stories were based on his experiences there. So these are some of the more earlier books that he wrote, and all of them have some form of autobiographical nature to them. And so the first few, or actually in many of these, they all are based on his experiences being the Marquette County prosecuting attorney, and then also just with his private law practices. When it comes to troubleshooter, some of the types of cases that he dealt, or the main character, Robert Traver, deals with are everything from an insane man sitting on his desk and appointing him the angel Gabriel, to cases of murder with dynamite, of church social hair pullings, and a wide range of others. So he gets into a number of different sort of crazy type of legal cases that he gets to deal with in that story. The next one, Danny and the Boys, which was published in 1951, that recounts the mischievous escapades of Danny and his boys, setting themselves up in a logging shack near the iron mining town of Chippewa in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Danny and his cronies spend their time fishing and hunting, storytelling, moonshining, and rampaging through the Chippewa saloons and the local hotel. And Small Town DA, similar to Troubleshooter, also focuses on those experiences that Voelker had while in the Marquette area. It's set in the fictional Iron Cliffs County, which is essentially Marquette County, and then focuses on different cases like murder that looked like suicide, his bout with a famous criminal lawyer known as Willie the Weeper, the up-and-coming case where defendant, justice of peace, and jurymen were all named Paulson and all happened to be related to each other, along with a host of other going-ons that made a district attorney's life anything but a dull one. And then lastly, the Anatomy of a Murder, which I think is the title book that pretty much made Voelker most well known. Which was published in 1958, adopted as a film in 1959, and it's based on a murder case in 1952 where Voelker was the defense attorney for a U.S. Army lieutenant who killed a man in Big Bay, Michigan, which is just to the northeast of Marquette, who had sexually assaulted the lieutenant's wife. And what happens in the book is the use of a rare version of insanity defense called irresistible impulse that hadn't been used in Michigan until last it had been used was in 1886. And the book was later produced as a movie in 1959 and filmed in and around Marquette at the places where the actual story had taken place. Featured actors Jimmy Stewart, Lee Remick, George C. Scott. And one thing that I also kind of find really interesting is that the judge in the movie was played by Joseph Welch, who was the real-life lawyer who was most famous for dressing down Joseph McCarthy during the Army McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. So a lot of great books that you can find by Robert Traver, also known as, or his real name is of John Voelker. Another one who is from Michigan, but from the Port Huron area, born in 1893, is Mary Frances Donor. She sold her first short story to a New York magazine in 1922 when she was 29. She was a graduate from Columbia University of New York, where she studied journalism, spent some time in Boston after her marriage, but would later return to St. Clair County, and then spent the last about 2 decades of her life in Ludington and taught creative writing there for several years, and then she died in Ludington in 1985. So a sampling of some of her books, Not by Bread Alone, which is light fiction with a heavy emotionalism for women, which sets one girl's uncertain, unstable pursuit of love against the background of the Middle West, Anne, whose drinking father, loose mother, gave her childhood a stigma of shame and scandal, is left to make her way alone and find out the different ways in which she tries to survive with the different sort of crazy aspects of what's going on in her life when she gets married, what later potentially happens with her marriage, different scandals, other different types of things that happen with that in Blue River, which was published in 1941. The Host Rock is another one that focuses on the search for uranium deposits in the Upper Peninsula in the post-World War II nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. That was published in 1952. Another one, Ravenswood, which is dealing with a family story set in small town on Lake Huron in the period before World War II. Pelage St. George, the old dowager, had married for the power and position of the St. George name rather than married the man she loved. She found that price too high despite the material gains. And then it also goes on to focus on her son, other different family members, and how they go about trying to go throughout their sort of lives. And then you can find out what happens at the end by reading the story and seeing if she's able to stay within the position that she had been. Blue River is certainly another one of those books by her, and that was published in 1946. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to a couple of the other ones we got here. James Beardsley Hendryx, who was originally born in 1880 in Minnesota, went to the University of Minneapolis for 2 years, worked as a newspaperman in Ohio, was a special writer for the Cincinnati Enquirer. All of his work is sort of set in that sort of Western fiction genre, mainly in Canada, Alaska, and Montana. So nothing that necessarily is based in Michigan, but because of the fact he spent a lot of time living in the Traverse City area, that's how we can kind of claim him as a Michigan author. You'll find that he wrote a lot of different series. Connie Morgan in Alaska takes place following one of his main characters that he liked to write about, which is Connie Morgan, a teen who from the lower 48 comes to Alaska in search of his father. This title showcases Connie's search for his friend in the blizzards and vastness of the North. And then Oak and Iron, of These Be the Breed of the North, which was published in 1925. Follows character David Gaunt and his experiences in the Canadian Northlands. He originally married Jean McDougall against the wishes of her father, who died cursing David and prophesizing his downfall. After Jean's apparent death, he married Elsie, a product of civilization, who in turn married David for the social position she felt his wealth and fame would give her. Man of the North is another one focusing on the adventuring for love and gold in the big woods, featuring characters Brian and Jeanette as they work to save the gold claim staked out by Jeanette's dying father. And then the Yukon Kid, which focuses on Kitty McGugan, who finds cities more cruel than her native Northland, and is a happy day for when, after very trying experiences, she is brought back to her favorite North and her rough miner friends. There are thrills aplenty in the story, including shootings, mine dynamitings, and such violent things. So a lot more of that Western flavor that you're going to be getting in James Beardsley Hendrix's books. And then lastly, as far as some of our more well-known authors at the time periods in which they were alive and publishing books, is Arnold Mulder, who was from the West Michigan area. He was born in 1885 and in Holland Township, Michigan, in between the Holland and Zeeland area. He was a newspaper and magazine editor, and then from 1929 to 1953, he was head of the English department at Kalamazoo College. Was the first Michigan novelist to make use of a Dutch background within their works, and he died in March of 1959. And then, as far as some examples of some of his books, The Dominie of Haarlem, which was published in 1913, a total conflict that arises when a city-bred minister comes to serve a rural Christian Reformed church whose members are bound by traditions and customs brought from the old world, and all the different conflict that comes from that. 1950s Bram of the Five Corners, which is set in 1902 in a poor rural settlement in southwestern Michigan, focuses on 5-year-old Bram, a sensitive and intelligent boy who dreams of becoming a poet, but at the insistence of an uncle who writes essays for a Dutch language religious paper, Bram goes to college to learn for Dominie. Once on campus, Bram is stirred by secular ideas and kind of reflects a little bit about what many people, once they go to college and higher education, sort of the different types of conclusions that they come to. The Outbound Road, which was published in 1919, focuses on Tennis Spijkhoven, an illegitimate child who is placed with a couple who hold that card playing, dancing, and theater are sinful, a notion that Tennis cannot accept as he grows older. He fails as a newspaper reporter, but eventually emerges as a famous American playwright and poet. And by reading the book, you'll find out how that all comes to pass. And then lastly, 1921's The Sand Doctor, which is set in the Michigan Dune country near the areas of Mulder's other novels, focuses on personal disagreements between Dr. Brian Quinton and his young wife Hallie, and between Dr. Quinton and his wife's brother, a man who preaches the gospel of success so prevalent in the United States in the 1920s. So these are all books that are by more well-known authors that are either somewhat known today or known for much more popularity at the time period in which they were writing. Now we're going to focus on more some just genres or topics within sort of Michigan, but focus on individual areas of interest within Michigan. So our first example is going to be Explorers and Native Americans, and 4 books that focus on that time frame and topic. First one, A Daughter of New France, with some account of the gallant Sire Cadillac and his colony on the Detroit, which was published in 1901 written by Mary Catherine Crowley. The first of 3 historical romances set in the Detroit area. Story takes place with the novel's fictional narrator, young Dennis Gowan, who is traveling with Cadillac to Detroit. They endure Indian attacks, a fire, Gowan's romantic problems, and you'll have to find out what happens to him if it comes to a happy ending or sad ending for both Gowan and Cadillac by reading the book. Joe Pete, which focuses on Ojibwa boy and Mabel, his mother, after the father deserts the pair. They live on Sugar Island in the St. Mary's River, an island that has been logged by Uno Jacola. Mabel disintegrates physically, mentally, and socially, but Joe Pete, rejecting the white man's ways, models, and traditions, plans to go to an Indian school. And then, and I should also point out that some of the topics of these books, it's important to remember the time frame in which they have been written. So there may be some things that have a bit of a different perception or focus today. Something maybe might not necessarily be politically correct or looked at differently nowadays. And so when you're looking at these books, it's something to keep in mind that the time period in which they were written might be much different with how we might perceive things today. Another one, The Forbidden Ground, which was written by Neil Swanson, was published in 1938. That's set in Detroit, or Detroit. The place is in Indian hands, and the English and Indians are enemies. The novel's particular interest lies in the details of the old Northwest fur trade, the attitudes of the English, and the role of the Indians in the uneasy changing social, political, and economic situation. And then lastly, 1945's Indian Paul by John Moore, which is set in an upper Michigan resort town over the Labor Day holiday after the summer visitors have left. The character Indian Paul is an alcoholic, and he murders his mother with an axe. Lodged in jail, he is seized by angry townspeople intending to vent their built-up anger towards summer visitors by lynching him. A sensible county doctor persuades the mob to take him back to jail. That night, some young hoodlums haul Paul off to the woods, intending on still lynching him. And you'll have to find out what happens to Paul and them by reading the book. I don't want to give away too many endings of any of these. Next, we're going to focus on just the settlement of Michigan. We've got Nebushin at the Bend of the River by Hal Cutler, which was published in 1917. It's the story of Henry Allen, who is 52 after his wife's death, goes into the Michigan Northwoods on the Pine River in Lake County and settles in a log cabin. Later, although he has been anxious to get far away from civilization, Allen mortgages his land to help pay for a dam across the nearby river and for a power plant for a new town. Next, we have Islanders, published in 1927, which is the life story of Ellen Darcy. An islander isolated from life's mainstream, Ellen is left alone on a farm near the small fictional town of Coldstream, Michigan, when the men and her family go to California in the gold rush of 1849 and then again leave for to go fight in the Civil War. She keeps the farm going until her banker's son sells the farm without her consent and keeps the money for his speculations. And you'll have to find out by reading the book as far as what happens in the end to Ellen to see if she is able to survive as a result of that farm being sold. Where the Loon Calls, which came out in 1928 and written by Harry Sinclair Drago, is set along the marshy coast of Lake Erie between Detroit and Toledo in the early 19th century. Features French-Canadian Antoinette Chevalier and her romances with three men, the son of a village merchant, a young blacksmith, and a man who smuggles whiskey and wool from Canada to Toinette's grandfather. And then lastly, A Table in the Wilderness, which came out in 1959. So it's kind of on the cusp of the focus of the books that I'm covering. I kind of figured the 1950s was sort of the threshold of which I wanted to back to stop. And so this is one that was going to be a much more later book. But it's set in 1818, tells of Lucina Lem of Vermont when her husband builds a home for them in Michigan's Livingston County, and then focuses on her entire life, which ends up being 100 years old, and all the different types of things that they had to deal with, like malaria and swamps and Indians and snakes. And sort of the big point of the book is to focus on how strong women are able to endure in places like this, and that they help build schools and churches and raise families, where it tends to be that men go off to fight in war. Next, we're going to focus on more of the lumbering focus. Michigan is well known for having lumbering being part of our history and society. The first one came out in 1901, which is called The Beleaguered Forest by Ilya Petty. Set in the Lower Peninsula's pine forest, Regina Gray, a blithe spirit, marries a wealthy lumberman she meets by chance, only to discover his occasional moroseness is a symptom of severe mental illness that at times puts her life in danger. At one point, disagreeing with her husband about cutting down the forest, she sounds a note that will occur in later novels about logging in Michigan. See how the lordy pines fall. Regina cries, at this rate, a little while there will be no trees left. Then The Blaze Trail, which came out in 1902 by Stuart White, focuses on the bosses of a lumber company, narrates the conflict between Harry Thorpe, an honest lumberman, and a group of loggers who are also timber thieves determined to drive him out of the woods, and also tells of the concurrent romance of Thorpe with Hilda Ferrand. Campmates in Michigan, or With Pack and Paddle in the Pine Woods, by St. George Rathborne, which came out in 1913. Set in the Upper Peninsula, focuses on three campmates, Ardolph, son of Cincinnati millionaire, Teddy, son of an area lumberman, and Amos, a real Michigan boy who has been raised in lumber camps. And then talks about all the different types of adventures that they go on with being in the lumbering camp and during that time period. And then lastly, we have 1952, which is a much more later one than the first three, by E.J. Peterson, which is about a 14-year-old lad refusing to accept the verdict that his father's death was accidental, sets out on his own to solve the mystery. We can't talk about Michigan without also without talking about the Great Lakes and the importance of water and how that is to the history and function of Michigan. So first, we're going to look at The Rapids, which came out in 1920 by Alan Sullivan. Follows Robert Fisher Clark, a man with a dream of what the energy of the St. Mary's River rapids might accomplish if they were harnessed by a dam, locks, and a power plant. Clark secures financing from American financiers, builds the Clark Industrial Works, discovers a source of iron, and opens an iron mine. But in the end, he fails, and you'll have to read the book to find out why. Resurrection Rock by Edwin Ballmer came out in 1920. Follows a crime taking place in an old mansion on a rocky isle in Lake Huron near the Upper Peninsula's South Shore. Lucas Cullen, who once made a fortune logging in the area, his granddaughter Ethel Carew, and Barney Luttrell, a man with a mysterious past, are the main characters. A Stranger on the Island, which came out in 1933, takes place on Beaver Island, ruled by one King Gorell. A romantic quadrangle develops involving Corell, a fugitive from Mackinac, and a Gorellite and his wife. So a little bit of a more soap opera-ish type of story. And then The Beckoning Waters, which came out in 1953 and was written by Robert Carse, a tale of logging, limestone mining, and shipping in the years from 1876 to 1932. Alan Kennard, an immigrant Irish sailor, becomes an industrial tycoon, a rival of the Rockefellers and their kind. Its rise paralleling the growth of Michigan industry and the Great Lakes shipping, eventually forced to take a stand either with the capitalists who aid him or his sailors who are forming a union. He sides with, you'll have to read the story to find out who. And then sort of our last topic of genres within Michigan of books that we're going to focus on this evening is farming. Like lumbering and like all the different other topics that we looked at previously, farming is certainly a big thing with Michigan. We're going to first look at Tents of Wickedness, which was by Mella Russell McCollum, and that was published in 1928, and it chronicles the 40-year marriage of Adam Whitaker, son of a Southwest Michigan Methodist farmer, to an equestrian in the small circus, Bess Marvel, who he first saw as she performed. The novel is set against a background of Adam's family affairs, small town and rural values and gossip. Bess, though her heart is always with her circus past, makes the marriage endure. Her reward comes in the discovery that a granddaughter will become an entertainer, though on a higher plane than that of a mediocre traveling circus. And then our next two, Once a Wilderness and Second Growth, these are both by the same author, and they both focus on there are major farm novels at a national level and significant in Michigan's literary history. Together, they form a history of the Mark family on the Mark section west of the present metropolis of Pontiac from about 1840 to 1920. The novels depict the evolution of the prairie into settled farmland, of the farm into the city, The arrival of the automobile coming in 1900 also contributes to that evolution of the change of the farmland to city. And then lastly, Clay Acres, which is by Pauline Benedict Fisher, which was published in 1938. Novel of the rise and fall of a family farm and the fortunes in 2 generations. James Gelston, a sane, close to the soul farmer, brings his less than bright bride Clarissa to up South Michigan in 1860. Indoctrinated with the culture of the East Coast, she stupidly allows their son to dissipate of the farm and family's fortune. You have to read the story to find out how all of that takes place. So that's about it as far as the books and authors that I'm going to be focusing on today. If there's any questions that anybody wishes to ask or anything else, I'm more than welcome to take it. Otherwise, if there aren't any questions, people are more than welcome to contact us at the Library of Michigan. You're able to do that by either emailing us at librarian@michigan.gov, or our phone number is 517-335-1477. Yeah, I think that's about it. How are we doing, Laura?
Yeah, we're doing good. I haven't seen any questions come through, but thank you so much. I definitely learned a lot. That was really fascinating. I feel like I need to take a trip to the James Curwood Castle too now.
Michigan.
That was beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who knew? Well, great. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. This is actually the first in a 4-part Live and Learn lecture series that takes place on Monday nights at 6 p.m. You can join us next week as we explore the topic of anti-racism and what we can do about it. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.